Okay, so I think I've said about 10 times that my name is Catherine and I'm a second year PhD student, so I won't do that one again. But just to recap, yeah, how can farming communicate better with its publics, its non-farming publics, to arrive at good choices about the future role of beef and sheep farming in the UK? And this has led me in my first year to think about two key elements which have going to form my thesis, which is around the concept of social license to operate and the Aristotelian concept, virtue of phronesis. Thanks, Sergio. Next slide. So before I get into the detail, I should confess to a little bit of researcher positionality. I'm also a beef and sheep farmer down here in Devon. This on the screen, you can see this is my farm. It's typical of the region, being a small grassland livestock farm with cattle and sheep. And I farmed here. I came here to farm with my family in 2001. And when we arrived, we established a herd of red ruby Devons. You can see the red ruby brown cattle in the picture, and Dorset down sheep, both of which are ancient native breeds of this region. And over the years since we came, the years of farming in this place, I've come to understand the cattle and sheep as central to what enables us to get our farm working for nature, working for the environment, and working for people, the people around us in our wider community, as well as ourselves as a farming family. So my understanding of beef and sheep farming is rooted in my experience of place. But over that time, it was becoming increasingly at odds with an understanding expressed in the more unbounded space of public discourse, where cattle and sheep appear to increasingly be understood as working against nature, working against the environment, and working against people. It became obvious to me that whatever different views people held about beef and sheep farming, the polarizing nature of the discussion was unsatisfactory for all participants, farming or non-farming, and that a different approach is needed if we are to build a collective understanding of which parts of beef and sheep farming in the UK are, or maybe, aligned to meet society's evolving values and its expectations to live sustainably within planetary boundaries. So this gap or schism between meanings and understandings and how we might collectively bridge the gap provides the focus for my research. And I think it's a gap that's commonly described in terms of a local global dynamic, which is certainly where I sort of started. But as time goes on, I'm beginning to move more towards an idea of it being a dynamic between real place and virtual space. And it's not a fully formed idea. I don't know if anybody's working in that area. It'd be interesting to hear. But I think there's something around the concrete and the virtual or the abstract. Anyway, I slightly digress. Next slide, please, Sergio. So, to one of my key elements of my research, which is social license to operate, which I'll refer to from here as SLO. Now, it was coined by a mining executive in 1997, a guy called James Cooney, who worked in the oil business. And it's a metaphor for the tacit authority held by communities to grant a business or a whole industry permission to operate. It's separate but interactive with legal licenses. And it's something which tends to be better recognized by its absence or loss than by its presence. And the metaphor was taken up into academia, mainly in Australia, because of the country's large extractive industries sector in the early 2000s, and it's now evolved into a body of research, albeit still rather immature, across a range of natural resource-based industries, principally energy industries, both fossil and renewable, forestry, fishing, and to a lesser extent, farming. Sergio, if you could hit return, I might have to pay you extra for that afterwards, but we should know if we go forward again and try hitting return, we should get another element to this slide. There we go. There we go. In 2002, following a series of disasters that beset UK beef and sheep farming, including mad cow disease and the foot and mouth outbreak, which two of you may have heard of, a landmark report called the Curry Report was published, looking into how UK food and farming could be made more sustainable in the future. And as you can see by the quote that I've used here, the Curry Report foretold the importance of social license to operate, or as the report called it, social license to farm. But despite this, little or no research into the concept of social license to operate in a farming context has followed. Yet since Curry, the context has only become more complex and in some respects more fraught. Red meat production is commonly viewed as one of the most problematic challenges facing society. Concerns about and competition for our commonwealth of natural resources in this backdrop of climate change is of course increasing, and everything suggests farming will need to take a more collaborative approach to decisions on what, how, where and why it farms, if it is to build a meaningful and resilient social license to farm. So the increasing salience of SLO to natural resource-based industries is clearly reflected in GlobeScan's 2020 radar report, for example, which found the concept to be one of the top 3 societal trends most likely to impact the viability of businesses in the future. I think the concept of SLO can potentially provide a way of thinking about how farming and wider society can navigate the complexity of issues around red meat production to make these good collective choices. However, to prize out the value of SLO, we need to find a way to operationalize the concept. And this challenge has proved to be its Achilles heel, which I think, if left unaddressed, risks a potentially useful concept being disregarded as just another truly magical pudding of a social theory. And I'd like that to be my analogy, but I borrow it from Ben Fine's writing on social capital, in fact. My research proposes that the limited utility of SLO may be overcome by operationalizing it as a model for dialogic engagement between farming and its publics. This could also potentially have some applications to other renewable natural resource-based industry sectors. But back to my focus, which is farming, the focus on SLO as a model for dialogue foregrounds the dependence upon the effectiveness of farming's public engagement to its long-term viability. Next slide, please, Sergio. And it begs the question then really about how do UK beef and sheep farmers engage with their publics? And the short answer is we don't really know. There is an absence of empirical research in the UK, but what largely anecdotal evidence there is suggests it may not be conducive to building a social license to farm. Although the need to connect with the public is something that is widely discussed within the industry, particularly since Curry, the dominant narrative tends to focus on the need to educate the public about the importance of farming and its benefits to society. Research in the USA and a couple of other European countries supports this hypothesis and therefore invites comparison with the scientific community's attempts since the 1980s to build public support for science by information giving to a presupposed uninformed public, an approach referred to as the deficit model of communication. Next slide, please. To illustrate this point, I've picked out 2 critique quotes from science and technology scholars Lewinstein and Maureen McNeil. and just invite you to replace the word science with farming to see how these critiques might apply to the farming community as much as the science community. And so what can farming learn from science's experience? Not just from public understanding of science, but from the shift since the 2000s towards a science in society approach, which emphasizes in policy, if not always in practice, perhaps dialogue. Well, Wynne and others, Brian Wynne, a notable STS scholar, and others call a note of caution, which if Sergio, if you could just hit return, that's it. We can see Wynne's quote there. Wynne's skepticism, essentially, that science's newfound practice of engagement constitutes a truly reciprocal, open and equal process between science and its publics, is a skepticism which finds itself echoed in some of the more recent SLO literature. A good example I'd like to share with you is two researchers, Lincoln Gentoff's research into management of another of our natural resources, fisheries. They found dialogue to be superficial, what they called a calibrated episteme, where the parameters and terms on what is ruled in for discussion are determined a priori by top-down institutional actors. Studies led by Australian academics looking at the role of dialogue in SLO processes have found a tendency for corporate actors to dominate by implementing a strategic form of dialogue aimed at constraining and controlling rather than opening and freeing the process for the benefit of less powerful stakeholders. So there is then more than enough evidence from the science community's experience to accept that it is not possible to inform the public into acceptance of farming, still less so its active support. So going back to the central proposition of my research, which is that SLO can be operationalized as a model for dialogic engagement between farming and its publics, my foray into public understanding of science literature raised this question for me. How can farming resist a false turn to an instrumentalized version of dialogue that all the evidence suggests will be no more likely to be to engender public support than the deficit model approach? Well, following in Wake and Gentoff's work on fisheries, this question brought me to your good friend and mine, Aristotle. Next slide, please, Sergio. So, as we all know, Aristotle wrote of phronesis in his sixth book of Nicomachean Ethics. As a humble rural sociologist, not even yet fully formed, I do not pretend to be a scholar of Aristotle. But I came to phronesis through the work of contemporary scholars, notably Bent Flischberg and Olaf Eikeland. Flischberg asserts that Aristotle understood phronesis to be the most important of a triumvirate of virtues, all of which are necessary for a well-functioning society. Where episteme is scientific knowledge or theoretical know-why, and techne applied knowledge or know-how, phronesis is both an intellectual and ethical virtue, a wisdom or intelligence applied to, and importantly, I would say, born out of practical action. We've maintained our use of episteme, epistemology, and technology, in our modern language. Strangely, phronesis has not travelled into our modern lexicon, nor arguably into our thinking and practice. And Flischberg picks up on this, associating phronesis with value rationality and episteme with an instrumental or means rationality. He contends that the unidimensional rationality of Western society, based on an instrumental rationality, is driving the profound degradation in health and well-being of both biosphere and sociosphere. Next slide, please, Sergio. And I'd like to illustrate this by way of a concrete example, just for a moment, take it out of the sort of conceptual. The BSE, or the mad cow disease, which was an epidemic in the UK starting in the late 1980s, through to the 1990s, when it became not just a matter of animal health and welfare, but escalated to a full-blown human health crisis because of its causal link to variant CJD, a brain disease fatal in humans. And this crisis started with a simple question: what is the cheapest and most productive source of protein to feed herbivorous dairy calves to get them to grow? So when a unidimensional society asks itself a scientific means-ends question, abstracted from any ethical or common sense context, it finds the answer to be ground up meat and bone meal, which, though correct in that it is the means to the defined end, exhibits a catastrophic lack of wisdom in practice, which produced terrible and fatal consequences for animals and humans, and arguably, I would suggest, caused the biggest erosion of UK cattle and sheep farmers' social license to operate of the 20th century. In his exposition on the ways of Aristotle, Eichland considers dialogue as central to the practice of phronesis. Eichland and Flischberg's interpretations highlight the relevance of phronesis to SLO as a model for public engagement, when the latter is conceived as A, processual, B, inclusive and polyphonic, C, dialogic, and D, inherently context dependent. I find it interesting that Eichland conveys also that Aristotle's understanding of the different but indivisible role of dialogue and deliberation to phronetic practice. He explains dialogue for mapping the crisscrossing topographies of the problem, both from my point of view and from how others see it. Whereas deliberation is not for mapping, but moving around in that space, but only once the boundaries have been collectively defined. So I think that's why, for me, phronesis uniquely provides an approach which could overcome in an authentic, instrumentalized practice of dialogue, which has been found to prevail in SLO processes, and as Gentov suggests, many aspects of our so-called participatory democracy. Phronesis may then provide the qualitative attributes to guide the SLO process away from a tick box tokenism towards authentic and transformative dialogue. But this is not to suggest phronesis as a quick fix for tokenistic engagement. Proper dialogue may indeed be transcending and transformative, but it also demands excellence of mind and of character, which I think we can all recognize as hard-earned or indeed elusive character traits. Only through repeated practice, by doing it, albeit imperfectly, in real messy contexts, can people move towards normalizing and mastering a value rational dialogic process. I hope that by understanding SLO as a model of dialogic engagement based on the attributes of phronesis, my research may have an impact by making a contribution to our understanding of the process by which farming and wider society can, to return to the title of my presentation, arrive at good collective choices about the future of UK beef and sheep farming in the UK. Thank you. And there's a couple more slides just to whiz through, Sergio. Thank you.